Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. Well, thank you, Aisha, for the introduction. My name is Deanna Metivier, and this summer I worked on a project to understand the use of climate information in state wildlife action plans. Before I begin, I would like to thank these individuals, as well as these organizations, for their continuous support throughout the summer. There we go. So before I begin, an overview for my talk today. What is the State Wildlife Action Plan, and how does it affect climate change, and what opportunity does that provide us? Methods, we conducted a broad analysis and then an in-depth analysis. Results, how did the states compare? And discussion, recommendations for future swaps, and some conclusions. So, what is the State Wildlife Action Plan? Essentially, it is a plan for managing and conserving wildlife over the next decade. 2015 was the first year that the federal government said, if you states want to receive funding, then you need to incorporate climate change. That's pretty much all the instruction that the states got. So, our research question is, how are these states addressing climate change in these plans, and how does this vary state by state? So, some relevance of this study. Why should we care about swaps? So, pretty much ecosystem services are what nature provides us for free if we take care of it. So these are things like clean air, purifying water, soil, food, pollination. I know you can't read everything that's visual, but those are just a few examples. And these swaps are describing how we're going to manage all those things that we care a lot about. So the results of this study can impact future swaps. Like I said, we're updating these every 10 years through these things that I'm going to describe called best practices. So we have swaps, we have ecosystem services. Where does climate change come in? So climate change is a direct threat to ecosystems, wildlife, and our natural resources. These pictures here are just a few examples of some of the negative impacts of climate change that we have already observed. This is a mountain bark pine infestation in Colorado, and this is a golden eagle, a species of greatest conservation need due to habitat fragmentation. And I know this image is kind of hard to see, but it just depicts a phenomenon called habitat shifting, which is the observed ecological phenomenon of habitats moving up in elevation and latitude because of climate change. And this is a wildfire, which are expected to increase in intensity and severity under a hotter and drier climate. So we've got all these negative things because of climate change affecting our ecosystems that we care about. And the worst part is it's not really going to go away. Committed warming is a phrase that scientists use to describe the fact that even if carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions were to drop to zero overnight, we would still see the effects of climate change because there's already enough stuff in the atmosphere to continue warming our planet. So all these things aren't really going to go away, and they're affecting the ecosystems and the ecosystem services that we depend on. So swaps are a really important tool for kind of managing how we deal with these changes. So what did I do? So first, we identified the best practices on incorporating climate change. So we took from the Bureau of Land Management's document called Best Practices and another paper called Scanning the Conservation Horizon. So then we had to collect our swaps, right? So we tried to collect swaps for all 50 states, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. Then we conducted a broad analysis. We scanned and scored for the use of the best practices that we identified. And then we conducted an in-depth analysis, and we focused in on one of the specific best practices. So this is what we were able to find by each state, and when I say find, our study was conducted this summer, and the swaps didn't have to be completed until October of 2015. So some states weren't releasing them yet. So the orange with the crosshairs, those are the states that we looked at for our in-depth analysis, and just the orange ones are the states we used for our broad analysis. These green ones are the ones that the states were not releasing for public viewing yet, or no, other way around. Orange are the ones that were available, but we didn't look at, and blue are the ones that were unavailable. So for our broad analysis, we screened for information regarding climate change and variability, and kind of just to get an initial understanding of the content. These are really big, like 600-page documents. So we soon realized that because they're so big, they're big, massive documents, we needed to develop a coding system to compare how these states are integrating climate information. So this is what we came up with. on a scale of 0 to 3, we looked at the amount of consideration given to each of these 7, and these are what I've been calling best practices. So species prioritization is just if they've selected species of greatest conservation need and they know like what they need to prioritize. Key habitats is if they've looked at like those ecosystems to preserve those ecosystem services that I've been mentioning. Threats is if they've selected the threats to climate change that are affecting those ecosystems. Monitoring, do they have a plan to set up to monitor these changes as the climate continues to change? Partnerships and participation. Some of our states are over 90% privately owned, so it's really important that states have a plan for engaging with private landowners. Identification of management and conservation options. So it's one thing if you've identified a threat from climate change, but it's another if you've identified what you can do about that threat. And finally, implementation of management options is kind of one step further. It's another thing if you've already put those policies and regulations in place. So I'd like to point out that this isn't just about checking the box on each of these. It's more, it's really like a scale of 0 to 3. So some are really doing it better than others. So the sum of all these kind of came out to be the level of climate change integration in the state wildlife action plans. So this is what we were able to find on each of the 7 states we used for our broad analysis. These are those 7 best practices, and these are the states. Wyoming performed the best and got 21 out of 21, and North Dakota was on the other end of the spectrum and clocked in at about 7. So for our in-depth analysis, we decided to focus on Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming. And we because they covered the spectrum of this climate change usage. So for our in-depth analysis, we were looking for information relevant to climate, specifically on habitats. And we chose habitats because we really only had time to focus in on one of those best practices. And in the face of a changing climate, it's better to focus on preserving ecosystem function and ecosystem services rather than focusing in on one individual species alone. So we look for things like temperature, precipitation, the impacts of climate change, drought, flooding, wildfire, sources of climate data, which models are they using, and ecological factors like habitat shifting and earlier onset of spring. So in order to receive funding, all these states have to incorporate climate change, right? But our results found that states are really doing this differently. So these are the 7 best practices again. And so for species prioritization, Colorado identified and ranked threats, and they had the vulnerability to each species ranked as high, medium, low under those threats to climate change. And for key habitats, North Dakota had really vague regions identified, like forests and rivers, whereas Colorado had really specific regions, like aspen and spruce fir. And for threats, North Dakota had the same conservation, or the same threats listed, same threats and conservation actions listed for each habitat, whereas Wyoming really integrated threats from climate change with human-induced threats. For example, they said, like, this area is really threatened by energy development, but it's also threatened by habitat shifting, so it really took a more holistic view instead of looking at climate change as a separate issue. So for monitoring, some states had created a follow-up system to monitor the success of management actions between swap revisions. Remember, we're updating these every 10 years. Partnerships and participation. So Wyoming has already conducted scenario planning workshops where they brought in multiple stakeholders to kind of brainstorm what exactly we're supposed to do about climate change. Identification of management and conservation actions. So Colorado recommended increasing stand heterogeneity to reduce the risk of fire and insects, whereas North Dakota just listed alter management plans, which might be a little bit more difficult for a landowner to implement. And finally, implementation of management plans. For this one, I just wanted to point out that it's not, like I said, it's not just about checking the box. It's really more of like a dynamic system in that the Colorado Vulnerability Assessment informs the identification of management options, which makes it more easier to implement those management options, right? So like I said, we focused in on the key habitat sections to analyze further. So for the key habitat analysis, this top row are the ecosystems that all 4 states identified and addressed in relation to climate change: grasslands and riparian/wetlands. And this bottom row, these are habitats that only Colorado and Wyoming discussed in relation to climate change, which are sagebrush, aspen, and subalpine forest. So some results of that. For grasslands, all states are concerned with the invasion of native grasslands, and 3 out of 4 states discussed the need to monitor changes. The South Dakota strategy actually included using C4 grasses, which are more adapted to a hotter and drier climate, as opposed to C3 grasses. And for riparian ecosystems and wetlands, Colorado and Wyoming have specific conservation actions listed, but they didn't specify who would oversee these actions. So by conducting the broad and in-depth analysis, this allowed us to make some swap recommendations and draw some conclusions. So I recommend that we all go out and buy sunscreen because Boulder, Colorado could be 108 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. So this visual is just trying to depict that. So the top is the low emission scenario. Boulder could be 86 degrees Fahrenheit, a lot better, right? And the high carbon emissions, we could be 108 degrees Fahrenheit. I know the numbers are kind of hard to see, but the importance here is just the difference, right? We're going to get one of these scenarios or somewhere in between. So we really need to establish a system for evaluating the effectiveness of these plans, right? We don't really know what's going to happen, and every 10 years isn't really enough to evaluate the success of the conservation actions to protect the ecosystems that we really care about. Another thing that we recommend is creating a guide for specific stakeholders. Like I said, these are really massive management plans, and it would really increase the usability if there was a section on what a forester should read, what a park ranger should read, what a policymaker should read. Or alternatively, it would be better if there was some kind of searchable platform so I could type in, I'm interested in grasslands, and that information could just come up. The next thing we have is develop a decision support tool. Colorado actually listed this in their swap. It's one thing to lay down like a 600-page document that's like, this is everything we're worried about in relation to climate change. But it's another if you don't really know where to start, right? What do we protect first? Where do we allocate our time and resources? Because climate change is a huge problem, right? Where do we start? Where do the boots on the ground people start? Facilitate cross-state learning. So a few slides ago, I showed some habitats that all states are concerned about. Yet South Dakota listed actions that others didn't, right? So it would really improve the effectiveness of the swaps if there were ways for states to, I don't know if they were talking to each other or weren't, but there was things that others listed that some didn't. So if there were ways to share that information, share the research on how ecosystems were being affected, that might save time and money. So finally, I would just like to conclude by saying that swaps are really powerful tools for building in strategies for sustainability and adaptation. Climate change isn't going away, so we really need to look at these first swaps and how they're protecting the things we really care about. And the best practices that we identified could serve as a really good tool for evaluating the integration of swaps as they continue to be updated. All right, any questions?
All right, thanks, Deanna. Oh, I see a hand.
Hi, good morning. Hey, if you go back to your map, it seems that all of the broad sites and the in-depth analysis are all clustered spatially in one region of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Just two quick questions. A, how come you guys decided to choose these states as the clustering part of that decision? And is the main reason you didn't choose any others time?
Yeah, great question. So we chose these first because they were available, right? We were able to track them down. And secondly, because my study is under a larger study that focuses in this region. So my mentor works a lot with the Western Water Assessment and with the North Central Climate Science Center, and they kind of focus in that region.
I was just curious, so did you talk to any of the people who actually created these swaps and maybe talk to them about what you found and have any plans for kind of showing them your work?
Yeah, good question. So I personally didn't. I emailed the head of like the North Dakota Game and Fish, and she sent me their swap. But I personally, my mentors have talked with people who have worked in the making of them, and I looked at like the interview notes, I guess.
Did you do any correlation with state funding? Do you have any way of correlating this?
Ooh, interesting question. I did not, but that would definitely be something to look into further after this.
All right. No more questions?
Well, thanks, Deanna. Great job.
Thank you.